Well, up first today is Frank, and Frank is from Germany. And his question is there a solution to the immigrant crisis in Germany/Europe? Or is history repeating itself, and are we on the brink of a new European war? Frank obviously has a bit of skin in the game here, so welcome to the show, Frank.
Good evening.
Hi. So what are you seeing from where you are?
Well, it's a very, very strange situation because everything, for example, I would say that you have said in your speech would make me hear a National Socialist. So just
Right.
for this information. And the other thing is, yeah, I encounter a lot of people who are now really scared about the situation. And whenever I talk to someone, they really, after a few seconds, the word war comes to mind, and the word war is said, that they are afraid of it. Because of all the, how can I say it, the tensions that start to rise, the fears that start to rise. And yeah, you have quite a divided situation in the people because most of them, how can I say it? They're afraid of themselves as Germans. And whenever I try to talk to them about situations that you talked about in your speech, for example, I can't get to them. And so when it's about the migrant crisis, they're full of empathy for the people, but are blinded by the empathy at the same time, if you know what I mean.
Oh no, I do. But go on.
And yeah, I mean, if you would like, I can give you an example.
Sure.
I had a discussion with a girl, and she talked about a neo-Nazi who hassled a little girl, a refugee girl, in a Berlin tram, and he ended the hassle by peeing on her and cursing her, and that's not the nice way to do this with another human being. But I gave an example of a situation I encountered here in my direct neighborhood. A confrontation between two kids. They fought with each other, and the German kid sought asylum in a house of another woman. Soon after, he was followed by um, a refugee kid, son of what's it called, Albanian man. And a few minutes later, even though they both arranged the situation and they were peaceful with each other, the father came in and demanded the little boy to speak with him. And he went straight to the boy, choked him, raised him up, smashed him on the ground, and hit him multiple times on the head, so that he was sent to hospital with a concussion and blunt force trauma with, yeah. It's just terrible. It's hard for me to talk about this because it was just in my neighborhood and I know the people. But in this situation, in this crisis, you get some kind of relativism. People compare the one with the other. The situation with the girl who was peed on is that, yes, but for most of us, it's the same. They don't, and it's terrible for me to think about that people see both of these situations as the same. This kind of violence happens, but this kind of thing is kind of terrible too. And Yeah, you get this in different colors, just only for it's just a kind of a glimpse of the situation. But
So just a sec. So the woman who was telling you the story of what was a neo-Nazi peeing on a refugee girl,
yeah,
was that something she had herself witnessed?
she's from Berlin, and she just read it in the paper.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, in all conflicts, there's massive amounts of propaganda, and generally, vid or it didn't happen, video or it didn't happen.
yeah.
So, somebody said, "Oh yeah, someone peed on a girl." Like that's just, I don't know. It doesn't like when you've studied the history of conflicts, you know that there's just so much propaganda floating around. Like, there's this poor boy who drowned in the surf. The family
Mm,
has had a lot of different stories to tell about it,
mm.
and so there is a lot of propaganda that floats around these kinds of conflicts, and the idea that oh, so some crazy guy peed on a girl, so now we have to let in 500,000 people a year. I mean, that doesn't even follow.
Indeed.
Even if, and also you could say, okay, so let's say there are neo-Nazis in Germany. I don't think there's lots, but let's say there are. And let's say that those neo-Nazis really dislike immigrants. Well, isn't that then just going to cause a lot of conflict to have immigrants come in? And isn't there going to be a massive amount of overhead having, say, 500,000 people coming from the Middle East as opposed to, say, 1,000 people from Denmark? I mean, where's the upside for the people?
Yeah, that's the same situation. I always talk to people and I ask them. So I always hear about, oh, it's a chance for us. It's a challenge we all have to take for the better. And I always ask them, what chance is there? Just mayhem and destruction and people hating each other and people are, yeah, they're not cooperating. And is this,
Well, I mean, and Islam has been around for about 1,400 years, and they can't seem to stand each other.
yeah,
I mean, they've had 1,400 years with the same general religion, and they can't stand each other. Like in Syria, right? You got the Sunni, you got the Kurds, you got the Shiites, you got a whole bunch of different factions, and the country was put together almost 100 years ago. And after 95 of those 100 years, it just descended into civil war. So these people have been living cheek by jowl, largely with the same religion. They've been living next to each other for almost a century, almost 100 years. And they're just slaughtering 250,000 of each other and destroying an entire country. And they have a lot more in common with each other than they do with the Europeans. So where do people think this is going to go exactly? I mean, it's not that hard to figure out.
I think it's just like you said, the propaganda of nearly 70 years losing the war and stuff like that.
No, no, it's not. It's not Germany. I mean, Germany has it bad. I mean, there are an estimated 5,600 violent neo-Nazis in Germany as of 2010, right?
Mm.
But it's not, no, it's not, man. You should hear the people in Canada here. Oh, it's a humanitarian crisis. It's time for us to step up. We got to care for these people. We got to do the right thing. We got to do. Fine, go over and help them. Go send them money. Go fly over and help them in Syria or in the Turkish camps or wherever it is. But all these people morally preening themselves, oh, I'm such a good person. I care about all these refugees and blah, 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 blah. Again, go help them. But don't force everyone else to back up your own moral self-congratulation and such a wonderful, caring human being that this is not... This is going to end in disaster. I hope it won't. I mean, I hope to be proven wrong. I really do. But can I just give you two very brief little things? Just
Yes,
indications that there could be some problems down the road. Just a couple of little things, right?
yes,
So number one, I don't know if you've heard of these. They're called no-go zones.
yes, of course.
Okay, so I don't know. I just looked up a paper, a 120-page research paper entitled "No-Go Zones in the French Republic: Myth or Reality." There are dozens of French neighborhoods, quote, where police and gendarmerie cannot enforce the Republican order or even enter without risking confrontation, projectiles, or even fatal shootings. A 2,200-page report, Suburbs of the Republic, found that Saint-Denis and other Parisian suburbs are becoming, quote, separate Islamic societies, cut off from the French state. and where Islamic Sharia law is rapidly displacing French civil law. The problem is being exacerbated by radical Muslim preachers who are promoting the social marginalization of Muslim immigrants in order to create a parallel Muslim society in France that is ruled by Sharia law. So here you have these areas in France which are not France.
It's the same here.
Yeah, I mean,
Massive
this is not
zones.
integration.
No. And I experienced it since I was born in the 80s. But I can say as soon as I could experience it and get to know the difference and the specialities of these situations, like what is my culture and another culture, and what are these people, what are they doing? You could see that since my earliest age, I could experience it. They try to separate themselves as a separate people inside the state where they live in. And every time here, when you talked about it, you're a Nazi. Because
Well, and this is the problem. The problem is that I really am always suspicious when there are significant social problems that nobody can talk about. When facts become a problem to the discussion itself has turned cancerous.
quote unquote free
And
speech.
yeah, I mean, no, we look, I mean, if you want to assuage people's fears about hundreds of thousands of people from the Middle East pouring into Europe, at least let people talk about their fears,
And
right?
they
Talk
don't.
about the facts that give them concern, but everybody gets screamed down. And
Yeah.
that is not a good sign. Here's another example. So 40 years ago, the Swedish parliament just basically decided to change Sweden from pretty homogenous to a multicultural society. Nobody consulted the Swedish people, just as nobody consulted those in America about whether they wanted to take third world immigration rather than European immigration, which had been working fairly well. I mean, do you expect there to be a referendum in Germany about whether these migrants should be taken in?
No,
No.
there won't
Why
be.
not? It's supposed to be a democracy.
Yes, but it
Angela
isn't.
Angela Merkel herself in 2010 said multiculturalism is a complete failure.
Indeed, but now she totally made a 180-degree turn in it and
It
said,
means someone has something on her.
of course.
It means that she's being blackmailed or threatened in some manner. I mean, someone has something on her that would destroy her career. I'm sure of it. Can't prove it, but I'm sure.
Or in general,
Okay, so
she just tries to work something out with other, how can I say it, entities,
yeah.
for another goal.
Yeah, so here we go. So homogenous Sweden, the violent crime since the importation of largely third world immigrants, violent crime has increased by 300% and rapes by 1,472%. Sweden is now number 2 on the list of rape countries, surpassed only by Lesotho in southern Africa. So in 1975, 421 rapes reported to the police. In 2014, 6,620. And that's over the past 10 to 15 years, immigrants largely come from Muslim countries, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and so on. And of course, you can't tell because the Swedish authorities are actively suppressing information about people's ancestry or religion when it comes to crime.
Political correctness.
Right. I mean, not to mention these rapes of Western children from the Pakistanis in England. People wouldn't protect the kids. In 2008, right, Denmark, right next to Sweden, not exactly on the other side of the world, Denmark had only 7.3 rapes per 100,000 inhabitants. There were 53.2 in Sweden. And in 2011, over 6,500 rapes were reported to the Swedish police, but only 392 in Denmark. And Denmark's about half the size. It's a huge discrepancy. And Statistics Denmark, the official statistics office, revealed that in 2010, more than half of convicted rapists had an immigrant background, and not a lot of immigrants in Denmark. And in 2002, it turned out that 85% of those sent, this is back to Sweden, 85% of those sentenced to at least 2 years in prison for rape were foreign-born or second-generation immigrants. A 1996 report by the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention reached the conclusion that immigrants from North Africa Algeria, Libya, Morocco, and Tunisia were 23 times as likely to commit rape as Swedish men. And they go through Iraq and all this, and it's even Ecuador and Bolivia 10 times as rape prone as Swedish men.
I mean, I always tell people.
That's not good.
No. I always tell people that they don't need to check the papers they don't trust. They just have to go to the courthouses and just check the papers outside of the courtrooms. You have the names on it and what they did, and it's always the same. Always violence.
Do they need a translator? That's a pretty good question. And my question is, where the hell are the feminists? All I heard about growing up was rape culture this and rape culture that, and rape is so terrible for women. And of course it is. Where are the feminists?
It could have consequences.
Where are the feminists when thousands of Swedish women are being raped? Where are the feminists? Of course, the feminists don't give a shit about women getting raped. They care about destroying the West, undermining capitalism, and just eradicating the family because they're a bunch of Marxists. They don't give a shit. I mean, this is one of these just mind-blindingly liberating moments where you just go, "Wow, feminists, you just pieces of shit." Because where are the feminists screaming from the bloody rooftops about this massive increase in rape? Oh no, because they got to go after the Duke lacrosse team and they got to go make up shit about rapes on campuses and all that kind of crap. But the fact that their actual almost 1,500% increase in rape, don't hear a thing. Don't hear a thing. And people say, "Oh, you see, it's blowback for European, American, blah, blah." Okay, so you go to a Swedish woman and say, "Well, I'm sorry, you had to get raped because 150 years ago, British people had an empire." Are you kidding me? And yes, it's terrible. There's this kid got drowned. Kid got drowned, and you see a picture. Terrible. However, where are the pictures of the Swedish women who've been beaten up and raped? Oh no, you see, that doesn't fit the narrative, so we can't show that. We can only show the most emotionally manipulative pictures we can to get people to shut up and go along. Oh, you don't want these people to come into your country. You must want war people to drown. It's like that kid only drowned because Europe opened the floodgates. The kid only drowned because Europe let people in. In Malaysia, where Muslims were fleeing, they were being, as they say, they were being oppressed by Buddhist monks. Not something I thought I'd hear in my lifetime, but they just gave them food and supplies and said, "Keep on going. We can't take you in." And in Japan, they had 5,000 applications for refugee status last year. They approved 11. In Japan, if you convert to Islam, you can go to jail. Who's screaming xenophobia at the Japanese? No one. Doesn't exist.
Yep.
Europe has been isolated and verbally abused for 60 years, in particular, of course, in Germany. And now they just have become these completely broken walkover countries where they have no laws, they have no borders, they have no cultures. And people are like, "Well, it's just moving and libertarian and open borders." It's like, okay, great. I'm happy with open borders. But number one, people have to be allowed to discriminate at every level. And number two, you can't be funding people to come over. I mean, some guy who comes to Germany from the Middle East is going to earn about 3 times his annual income just on welfare. That is not an even playing field.
And the people suffer from it, here especially. I mean, I don't want to say people otherwhere don't suffer, but I mean, families are thrown out of their houses. The state just comes to them and says, "Well, the house you live in with your 8 kids, just search for another flat. We need it for refugees."
Are they really? They're just taking people's houses?
Yes, they did it multiple times. And
wow.
they even took I think it's kind of a propaganda thing, but they took a 4-star hotel and transformed it into a refugee camp.
Right.
I mean, what are they trying to send? What kind of message do they want to send to the people they should protect? And
Oh yeah, no, I
I
wouldn't
mean,
rely on the government for that.
no, it's, I mean,
And it just
it's,
because people don't know the history of the region, and I'm certainly no expert, but I know enough to be dangerous as usual. But because people don't know the geography and the history of the region, they don't understand just how completely bizarre it is for these people to come to Europe. Like it makes
of
no
course.
sense. It makes no sense because, for first of all, they say, well, the U.S. has been bombing the country. U.S. has been bombing the country. Okay, well, let's look up the numbers.
Hmm.
And in 2014, across Iraq and Syria, less than 500 civilians were killed by U.S. bombing. On the other hand, 15,000 ISIS warriors were killed. And I'm telling you, those 15,000 ISIS warriors probably would have killed a lot more than 500 civilians. And in Syria, it was less than 200. Less than 200 killed by American bombs. Now, 250,000 people killed in Syria, less than 0.1% were killed by US bombs. So who is killing all the Syrians? It's not the Western powers. It's other Muslims.
Of course.
And a lot of these, all right, so Syria has a Sunni Muslim majority, right? Shiites and Sunnis, and the Kurds and others as well, right? So the Sunni Islamists that are in there fighting have taken over northern Iraq and are waging war in Syria. They were backed by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other Sunni states. Sunni fighters, Sunni states. And now a lot of the people who are fleeing are Sunnis because it's majority population. Now Iran's Shia government, they back the Assad, the government in Syria with cash and weapons and soldiers and stuff like that. So it's one of these proxy wars where, like in the 50s, there was a proxy war between Russia and America in Korea, and in the 60s and 70s, it was in Vietnam. And you get these proxy wars where these two, right? And these proxy wars are between Sunni and Shiite Muslims with Saudi Arabia and Qatar on the Sunni side, and Shia governments like Iran backing the other side, backing the government. Not a lot of Europeans and Americans in that situation. And the Sunni extremist group, almost defeated in Iraq in '07, well, Al-Qaeda and so on, they sort of grew under ISIS and all of that. And so you've got a bunch of Sunnis who've been displaced right on the border with giant and very rich Sunni countries. Like, I know Qatar is not big, but Saudi Arabia is huge. And so the idea that you've got Sunni Muslims right next door to Sunni Muslim countries and not going to those Sunni Muslim countries, but instead going to Europe makes no sense. Makes
Absolutely.
no sense whatsoever. And I don't know, obviously, what all these Sunnis are like or any of the, I don't have any particular personal experience of the region. Went to Morocco once. Doesn't really count, right? But I don't generally judge people directly without direct experience, but I at least can judge those around them. And if the Saudi Arabian Sunnis don't want any of the Syrian Sunnis, that's not a good sign. That's not a good sign. If the Sunnis don't want them, how are they going to fit in Europe? Because Saudi Arabia is saying, for whatever reason, well, we don't want them. They can't come here.
Yeah. And the next
Well,
thing is they may meet up here and they fight again. The whole travel or the whole journey of escaping a war has no sense if you meet up again and have a reason to fight again in another country and make the other country your personal war zone. And it already happened
of course.
multiple times in the last weeks.
And,
So,
and it's the idea that this is blowback. Germany never even had a colony in the Middle East.
yeah,
Never had a colony in the Middle East. So what the hell is this blowback for Germany for?
they claim we sent weapons to them. So that's the reason why we have to endure this situation.
Well, I mean, didn't send nearly as many weapons as Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Iran did.
Of course not. But
And the idea that somehow all of this happened, right? So, okay, so the country got destabilized, obviously, right? I mean, there was a big mess. American people were lied to, and America went to war in 2003 against Iraq and decapitated the government and disbanded the military, which created a fertile breeding ground for terrorism and all that kind of stuff. And then what happened was under George W. Bush, the president of Iraq said, hey, if your troops keep staying here, we're going to have to subject them to Iraqi law. And he's like, whoa, not fun being the conqueror if you have to be subject to the laws of the place. So we're out of here. Then they scheduled to leave in 2011. And Barack Obama followed through on that. So then there was a massive withdrawal. And then people say, well, then, of course, there was this violence and ISIS and civil war and shit. It's like, oh, my God, that's so ridiculous. Do people in the Middle East have no free will? Do they have no moral responsibility? They have no personal agency of any kind? I mean, gosh, just look back at the history of your country. Germany had the living crap bombed out of it all throughout the Second World War, particularly at the end. And your leader met an untimely end in a bunker with cyanide or whatever the hell he used to kill himself. Now, Germany was bombed to hell and gone, and their Saddam Hussein, your Saddam Hussein, was killed. And did Germany start setting fire to people in cages and boiling people alive and beheading people?
No.
No. No.
Of course not.
You know who else didn't have a great time in the Second World War? Japan.
Indeed.
Massive fire bombings, 1,000 plane raids over Tokyo, made largely of wood. And 100,000 people died in a single night of bombing. So massive bombing in Tokyo, massive bombing throughout Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 nuclear weapons, the effects of which are still being felt, and massive destruction in the country. Did they turn to the kind of crazy stuff that's going on in the Middle East now? They did not. Both Germany and Japan went, okay, militarism, not so great for us. So let's do the sensible thing and right? Stop being insane and start being productive. So the idea that, well, there was destabilization from some external source, therefore we have all of this, is saying that, what, people in the Middle East are just like robots? Like they just program, they can't think for themselves, there's no choice, if that's true, then these are the last people you can have participating in a democracy. I don't think it's true, but people just like to blame the West for every bad thing that happens in the world.
And that's the thing, it doesn't add up. You don't get an answer you could be satisfied with. It's always this, but it can't be. It doesn't mix. You can't have these two parties coming together and say kumbaya and everything is all right. So there are points where they rub each other, and where there's friction, there will be heat.
Rub each other?
I mean,
you
where there's
sound like a fun night in Chinatown. No, it is not rub each other. My God, man. I can't judge any individuals. I'm a philosopher. I don't care about individuals, right? That's like saying that a physicist cares about just one atom. No, it's patterns. I don't care about individuals. I do care about ideologies. You can't judge individuals. You can't judge ideologies, right? And, there is a commandment in Islam which says go to foreign countries and spread Islam, right? That's one of the deals. It's one of their holy missions. There's another one which says, hey, if you're an atheist, you're killed. Now, again, it's not speaking about every single Muslim, of course. I'm not judging the individuals. People have a tough time understanding this. I'm judging the ideology.
I mean, you get this with the children. They are trained like they were raised to be lions, to be conquerors and to...
Wait, which children? You mean the Middle Eastern kids?
Yeah, of course. They live here. The ones who live here, they are trained from little children like that, and so you can't expect to have a human being or a grown-up who's not only gentle. He doesn't need to be gentle, but who is compassionate and who tries to understand the other culture, because he is the premium one. He is the one who should get all the girls, and how dare they deny him this?
Oh yeah, there's nothing like the narcissistic rage of a member of the chosen people who doesn't succeed, right? We've seen that among Jews, we've seen that among Muslims, and it happens in various places. If they can raise your vanity to the point where any prick to that vanity creates explosive rage, that's not
And you
And
get
people
this.
are saying, well, well, you see, the Western governments did these bad things, and therefore the people, like blowback and so on. It's like, okay, so wait, are we supposed to judge an entire group by their popular representatives? I mean, is that how it's supposed to work? Okay, let's universalize that.
Mm.
If I remember rightly, there was a by now food for fishes fellow named Osama bin Laden who carried out a series of terrorist attacks around the world, killed thousands of people. He was quite popular in some Middle Eastern quarters. Quite popular. You could buy T-shirts of him in the bazaar, and people were dancing and cheering. Not everyone, of course, and people were dancing and cheering. So he was a very popular person, people's representative. Does that mean that we can judge all Muslims by him? Of course not. And so let's say that even a majority of people did vote in certain Western leaders who made bad decisions. First of all, the people were lied to. Second of all, the people are raised by the government and propagandized like crazy. Third of all, you can't disagree with your leaders in a democracy because you get thrown in jail. If you don't like the war, you got to pay the taxes to support it anyway. If you don't, you get thrown in jail. So the idea that the Westerners are somehow massively in control of their own governments, it's not the leaders who are going to suffer in the West, because the leaders all got security, and the leaders all have their gated communities, and the leaders sure as hell aren't living anywhere near these no-go zones, and certainly not within them. It's the average person who is going to suffer, and it's their children. What the hell is going to happen to German education when you have this many people who don't speak German coming in to the school system?
I mean, it's already dumbed down for the people. They, we have a three-school system. It's a little complicated to explain, but yeah, the grades just went down and down and down, so they can meet up the things they can do.
Well, this is another issue too, and it's something well worth pausing on. And this information is generally so suppressed that you can barely even talk about it. But the average IQ in Syria is in the low 80s. That is really bad. Now, people could say it's either environmental or it's genetic or it's a combination of the two. From what I understand, it's about a combination of the two, and there are estimates that range between 40 and 60% of IQ is genetic. Now, let's say that there's a strong genetic component to the low IQ in Syria, and there's lots of work happening in the human genome to map the alleles which are responsible for creating greater intelligence in people. So let's say that there's some genetic component to it, then what you're doing is you're bringing in a bunch of people who can't handle Western civilization, not through any fault of their own. Just like there's not a lot of Chinese guys in the NBA because Chinese people are kind of short. There's exceptions, of course, just as there are wonderful, smart, brilliant, moral Syrians. But in general, you're bringing a whole bunch of people in, not only with no tradition of the West, not only with no tradition of separation of church and state, not only no tradition of the Judeo-Christian moral philosophy, not only with no history of compromise, of free trade, of any of those things, but they don't have the functional capacity to operate in a free market, post-industrial, democratic society. They don't they're not smart enough to do it. Now, if it's genetic, that's really terrible because that ain't going to change, right? I mean, not in any, maybe over 1,000 or 2,000 years, but certainly not when you've got the welfare state teaching the least intelligent people that the best way to gain income is to make more dumb people. But let's say it's all environmental. Okay, 100% environmental, no problem. Well, then you have a whole bunch of people with an IQ of 82 bringing up children. Can people with an IQ of 82 bring up really smart children? I'm not sure they can. How would you feel if your child's teacher had an IQ of 82, which is more than a standard deviation below the average in Europe? It can't it's not just the religion. It's everything.
I mean, I always tell people that our genes and who we are is formed by the ones we surround us and by the area we live in and the different challenges the area gives us, for example, develops these these ways to get the IQ you need to survive in this area. I mean, if the sun shines all day and if you don't have to plow through snow to get to your food, it's quite more easier to get the things you need. So where's the challenge? And I think that's these are things that embedded themselves in the genes, IQ wise or challenging wise. I think it's part of it, or at least.
No, there is a history of the fire and the ice people, and there's various theories about the degree to which the challenges of farming and surviving in a country half the year landlocked by ice and snow, that does provoke significant progress. And if you look at the history of the Jews, according to the genetic analysis of the alleles that some people believe are responsible for significant Jewish increases in intelligence, they're only a couple of hundred years old. Right? I mean, it took that 5,000 years of very selective breeding in the Jewish community to produce the higher IQ that you see in the Jewish community. It's a long, long process to improve human beings. And we're talking about human people, human tribes that have been separated by between 50 and 100,000 years of evolution. That is a lot of evolution, because remember, people didn't live very long in the past. They started having kids at 12 and died at 25. So you had some pretty compressed, 8 generations in a century. And after, there's also arguments that say that because the Europeans ended up, I know it's weird but true, having sex with Neanderthals, that this also created a massive explosion in the diversity and accelerated evolution in the northern gene pool. Plus, of course, you had successive waves of plagues throughout Europe, which generally wiped out the less intelligent who were congregated in cities, because the smarter people got out of town and stayed out of town as soon as they could. And the amount of suffering that has occurred to produce, hey, I don't think I need to save my seed crop till spring. I'm hungry now. I'm dead, right? I mean, the amount of suffering that had to happen to raise the IQ. And it's even worse, the amount of suffering that happened out in the Eastern Asian people, out in the Siberia and all this. I mean, it's not, and also there's biological incompatibilities. Right. Like, so people talk about how terrible it was for the Europeans who came over to North America and the native Indians and so on. Yeah, some of it was terrible, but there's a biological incompatibility. So in Europe, of course, alcohol was first distilled and beer was first produced and wine was first produced thousands of years ago. But in Europe, particularly when Europe became agricultural, we Europeans developed genes that controlled or limited our susceptibility to alcoholism. Now, you didn't want to have genes that said no alcohol at all, because beer was a lot safer than drinking the local cholera-laden water sometimes. So you wanted to drink beer sometimes, because if you didn't drink any beer, you'd probably die from some waterborne illness or ailment. But you also didn't want to become an alcoholic. So the genes to manage alcohol intake developed in the European stock over 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years, depending on sort of how you measure it. But it happened pretty effectively and pretty efficiently. Now, the Native Americans, who had no exposure to alcohol, had not developed the genes to limit the effects of alcoholism. And this is one of the reasons why, tragically, you see a lot of alcoholism in North American native populations. I've actually been to these reserves. It's pretty brutal stuff. But it's not, oh, they're so sad because their culture was taken away. I mean, obviously there's aspects to that, but fundamentally there's a gene incompatibility. And this happens in the realm of illnesses as well. Like the average white person who went into Africa in the 18th century didn't even last a year before some god-awful brain parasite from the Congo took out his brainstem and shat it out its ass. And so this is one of the reasons why the slave trade couldn't happen with white people. They had to wipe them from black people because they couldn't go in. There's biological incompatibilities. Just try putting tropical fish in with freshwater fish. See how well it works out. It doesn't, right? And so there's illness incompatibilities. There are illnesses showing up in America because of the migrants coming up from Central America and Mexico. There's pathogens showing up in America that haven't been seen in a generation or two. And the same thing is going to happen. There's biological incompatibilities that are not that easy. You can't just, everyone's the same. Kumbaya, let's link hands. At every conceivable level. And the idea that the people have to suffer for the decisions of their leaders is truly insane. It's like saying, well, see, there was a man who was out there poking a hornet's nest. The hornets flew past him and are stinging the crap out of his screaming children. So yay, justice. No, it's not the fault of the people. I mean, The massive anti-war protests throughout Europe, the biggest anti-war protests in 2002, 2003, the biggest anti-war protest that has ever occurred in the history of this planet. Did it stop the war? No. The people had no control over their governments. Stop blaming the people for what the governments do.
And that's the thing here. What else does this whole situation have any good for people but being against the people to control and divide them? You know? I can see a situation where I can say, well, this is because they always try to tell us we need more workers. The German population is aging very rapidly and we don't make a lot of children. But my theory is, well, then in times like these where there's so much trouble and everyone is afraid of the next eco crisis and blah blah blah, but maybe it just doesn't, you don't need so many children. Just mellow it out. Let some have just one child. And after 20 years, maybe they have 10 again. But in the situation like this, what good does it do?
Well, only smart people care about overpopulation. Overpopulation and the fears of overpopulation and the fears of environmental carrying capacities and environmentalism and so on is just a great way to get smart people to not breed, because
Of course.
less smart people don't give a crap. Now, of course, governments only care about the birth rate because they've made promises to voters that only a steady stock of new workers are going to be able to provide, right? Because they stole all of this money from the population as a whole by promising them these fabulous retirements and free healthcare and all the dental floss you can eat, and right. So they stole money for generations from people, promising them this great retirement, and then they spent all that money and they have no money. So like vampires ran out of blood, they're starting to eye the tomato juice, right? So they want to bring people in because not because they don't care about how many people there. I mean, they only care that they're going to get into trouble with the older voters if the younger people aren't there around to strip their kidneys off, sell them for parts on the black market, and shovel another round of cards at the old people, right? So yeah, I mean, and if you want people to breed more, it's not that hard. Just lower their taxes. It's really not that
Yeah.
complicated. Human beings don't breed, at least smart human beings don't breed very well in captivity, which is why as you go up the intelligence ladder, fertility declines, right? Mike, what was that statistic you found about IQ, women and IQ and maternal feelings?
Let me see. I forget the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I believe there was a correlation between a woman's intelligence, her IQ, and the likelihood of her having children. The more intelligent the woman, the less likely she was to be having kids.
And it was dose dependent, if I remember rightly. The higher IQ went, the less maternal feeling you had, or the fewer children you had.
Yeah, let me pull that up. I'll get it to you in a second.
Yeah, and that's people make this mistake about welfare, right? And they say, well, the welfare state can't be why there's more illegitimacy because you see, the welfare state isn't really that good a deal. You have a couple of kids and you're just living hand to mouth and you don't have a lot of excess and you can't go to vacations in Costa Rica. You're just kind of getting by, which to anyone with any brains is a pretty terrible deal, which is why it doesn't work for smart people. But if you've got an IQ of 90 to 95, like a lot of single moms do, welfare is a pretty good deal. You're not going to make that much money outside of welfare. You get a lot of money now. You don't have to work at a crappy job because when you're not that smart, you generally only get crappy jobs. Welfare is the old thing that people who are smart mistake people less intelligent for themselves and say, well, I'd never do that. Right? So it can't be why it happens. It's like, no, you have to put yourself in the mindset of people who are a lot less smart than you are. And what decisions will they make? And what kind of forethought will they? Somebody with an IQ of 90 or 85 is not sitting there saying, well, if I go to work now, then in 15 years I'll be making more than like, no, it's not how they think because that impulse control is not a big feature of low intelligence people.
Yeah, that's the thing. We now get around 5 million when they let their relatives come too, who are probably not very high on the IQ scale. But the government always tells us, yeah, there are a lot of engineers and technicians who are well trained and just want to work and work for you, and we need them
Oh, you mean
because,
that people coming out of war-torn Syria
of course,
are these great engineers who are just going to slot perfectly into the German economy?
And if they
without speaking any German.
and if they are that trained, why aren't their countries, their own countries, like Germany already? I mean, they should be on the high tech scale way up if they have so many engineers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just,
Oh no, I mean that's all just a bunch of lies. I
yeah.
mean,
I mean, and the thing with the Native Americans that you said, it's the same. I mean, we have native Germans. It's like they actively do the same thing again like they did with the native Indians. At least I have the feeling it is like that because I'm one of them.
right.
So,
Sorry, I just have to correct something here. Mike gave me the study. The mean childhood IQ of women who've remained childless for life is 105.3, whereas the mean childhood IQ of women who've become parents is 101.7. It's statistically significant. Maternal urge decreases by a quarter for every 15 extra IQ points. This is part of the dysgenics, partly of life, which is really exacerbated by the welfare state.
And this is using UK information, just so everyone knows. Those averages are from the Britain Offices of National Statistics. So
Yeah, it may not be worldwide, but that's how it goes that way. And the other thing too that has struck me as well is just the degree to which people from the West are just not allowed to have any particular interests. I mean, not allowed to have any sort of national or cultural sense of value and importance. Like, let me give you an example. So colonialism from the West was considered really bad because these were Western values being imposed and infiltrating other countries, right? It's really bad when Westerners go over and impose values on other cultures. See, that's really, really bad. But these no-go zones in France, apparently, nobody can talk about that. But isn't that people from the Middle East going to France and then imposing their values on French districts so the French people can't even go there? I mean, you are a French person. Your ancestors may have died to keep France French. And now there are significant places in your own country you can't even go. How is it bad for Westerners to impose their values on other countries, but other countries come to Western countries, impose their values, and nobody can even say anything?
I mean, you had it in the UK too. The riots and the violence from particular no-go zones. And I mean, I don't see a very bright future in the next years because all these riots will accumulate here too.
And I know what you mean, and I've lost some sleep over this issue,
Yeah.
but let me lay out for you a scenario which may give you some hope. Are you
Hope
ready?
is needed.
Are you ready to smile again? Give me some Leda Hoderson tap dancing. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. Mike, I'm sorry to keep trying to extract information from you like I'm some crazed Steve Martin dentist in a flower shop. But Mike, can you give me the cost to Germany, estimated, even in the short run, for these, what has Merkel said, 500,000 a year for the next couple of years?
all right, I will find it.
All right. Okay, so we'll get this number. Now, let me give you a little hope, Frank. First of all, people have just gotten soft. They've gotten soft. And we have been, and I love women and I'm surrounded by women and women are great, but people have gotten soft. And they've gotten soft because women are very sentimental. And that sentimentality, that inability to look at suffering and recognize it as necessary and important has kind of gone from women into the mainstream as a whole. So Germany's going to spend $6.6 billion to cope with 800,000 migrants and refugees, expected to have crossed into the country by the end of 2015. $6.6 billion. And this, oh my God, don't even get me started. This is the country that really hated funding the Greeks. Remember? Ah, those Greeks, they just sitting around on their sun-drenched islands, sipping their ouzo and frappuccinos, and here I am going to work in the snow. Those Greeks, I can't believe I have to fund those Greeks. Oh, bunch of Muslims? Yeah, come on in. Happy to. I mean, this makes like this makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. Oh, wait a second. Do we share a strong philosophical tradition, pretty much the same religion, and a very united cultural background? We hate giving you money. Oh, wait, hang on. Oh, we've been traditional enemies for 1400 years. Come on in. Have some money. I mean, it's madness. But anyway, let's get back to the hope part.
Where's the
I'm not-
smile?
I know, no, hang on. Sorry. This is going to hurt a little. I don't feel better. Sorry. Okay. All right. So this is going to break the European welfare state. It is going to break the European budget as a whole. Like the extend and pretend house of cards of European bullshit fiat currency financing will not survive this.
I'm smiling.
Oh, I'm telling you, right? So if the people came here for the welfare or came to Germany for the welfare, which a lot of them say that they did, right? They stopped in Hungary and said, wait, I think I can upgrade by getting to Germany. So if they came for the welfare and they break the welfare state, they probably won't stay.
Well, sometimes it's
I'm not saying they're doing a lot of favors. It's certainly not their plan. But there's no conceivable way that the European welfare state can survive this. And it's not just the welfare state. The cost of policing is going to go through the roof. The cost of education is going to go through the roof. The cost of healthcare is going to go through the roof. There's a study in England that points out that Muslims, because they have an unfortunate habit of marrying their cousins, have a lot of inbred genetic problems, which really, really jacks up the price of healthcare. I mean, just circumcisions alone. Anyway, so the cost of everything is going to go through the roof. And there's simply no way that the countries have the economic. You've got an aging population. You have a lot of unemployed youth. There is no possibility that the semi-socialist welfare state can continue. Now, right now, it's easy for people to be pompous and self-congratulatory about their infinite humanity in helping these migrants. Why? Because nobody's paying for it, right? So the Germany's going to need $6.6 billion. I mean, and it's going to be probably $40 to $60 billion because you just take every government estimate and times it by 10, right? Like Dick Cheney was on the, was being interviewed the other day. And he said basically the problem, is that Obama took the troops out of Iraq and that created a power vacuum. This is the same guy who said, oh yeah, we'll be in and out within 6 months. Right. So this is how insane the media is. I mean, that's why nobody lets me interview Dick Cheney, because I'd be like, Dick, can I call you a dickhead? Yes, thank you. Dick, you're now saying that 7 or 8 years after the war you said would only last 6 months was not nearly long enough to stay. Are you kidding me?
That's when he shoots you in the face. Right at that point right there.
Yeah, that's right.
I thought you were a pheasant.
Well, I am well feathered. But not peasant. Peasant. It just takes the H out. So basically you didn't know enough about the war. You thought it was going to be over in 6 months. So the problem, the war should only have lasted 6 months, but the actual problem is after 7 or 8 years, it should have lasted infinity longer. I mean, this is just so insane, right? how anybody has any credibility in these areas. And of course, a lot, as I mentioned before, a lot of the same people who are saying, we got to go in and help the rebels because Arab Spring and freedom. Okay, so a lot of people wanted to go in and help those rebels in Syria, and that destabilized the entire country. 250,000 dead, 4 million people displaced, half the population of the country on the move. Those same people who said, we got to go and help the rebels, are now saying, well, you fucked up the country, you got to accept the consequences. What? What? Oh my God.
I mean, the news information I got is that most of the Syrian refugees were concentrated by Turkey in a big camp around 2 million. And now they just opened with the correspondence to the US the floodgates and just let them all out, basically.
What, Turkey let them out?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, what's weird is that, I mean, boy, you think the IQ is low in Syria. Just think of how stupid the Turkish people are. I mean, why would you want to turn out all of these wonderful and highly productive engineers and lawyers and doctors?
Yeah.
These people are a massive boon to your economy. Why are you fencing them in? What does Turkey know that we don't?
And by the way, the whole situation with the refugees, like I said, concentrating them in kind of camps is not very good for Germans in the historical thing.
No. Well, I was
Repeating
saying
this.
Yeah, I was saying this to Mike and Soyan the other day. So imagine you're Angela Merkel. Okay, put on the giant corset of nipple-hugging evil, and imagine that you're Angela Merkel, and there's a bunch of people coming up on your shores, or a bunch of people, and it's like, hey, let's have the police round them up and put them on trains. Oh, how's that going to play? Shouldn't we be seeing this in black and white? Like, this is why Germany is just paralyzed. And I get it. Listen, I get it. You know, people come to me and they say, oh, but Steph, don't you care about these refugees? They're human beings too. Yes, they are. It's terrible. It's terrible. And thousands of children die every single day from starvation, and terrible things happen in the world. But the children aren't responsible, so I don't see why the German children are going to have to grow up in this messed up situation. The children aren't certainly responsible. The lessons to be learned from the West are stop interfering in other countries. Stop interfering in other countries. You could use this as a learning opportunity to make things a lot better, or you can... people who are saying, well, you know, we've got to have the government come in and take care of and deal with, the government's got to take care and deal with all these migrants and it's got to set up all these programs. And the government, it's like, you know that this is the same government that you say screwed up these countries to begin with. Now, screwing up countries is a lot easier than getting two oppositional cultures to mesh together and work in harmony, right?
And why should you listen?
Well, no, I mean, it's the same people who fucked up these countries that you're now expecting to get atheists and secularists and Christians and Muslims to all live together in one happy family, which has never happened anywhere except maybe one construction company outside of Israel. So if you want to solve the problem, you can't hand it over to the government. Because the people say, well, the government is so incompetent, they screwed up all these countries. Okay, well then the government that screwed up all these countries is the same one that's going to be trying to integrate these migrants. How do you think that's going to work? It's a lot easier to break a virus than it is to make one. And it's a lot easier to break a country than to positively and effectively deal with the fallout.
And if this system would work, the USA would be the most peaceful place on earth. But, well...
All I know is that Muslims generally can't live with other Muslims. Oh, also, you know, Jews generally have the highest recorded IQ as an aggregate in the world. Now, I know that in Israel it's lower than it is for diaspora or Ashkenazi Jews, but I assume the leadership is pretty smart in Israel. And Israel, do you know what they're doing with regards to these migrants?
Just some information. Of course, they don't treat them very nicely.
No, they building a fence.
Yes,
building a fence. So the Jews know the Muslims quite well. They've been living cheek by jowl for quite some time. So again, can't judge all the Muslims, but let's just see how the Jews view them. And I'm not saying, sympathy to Jews, no sympathies to Muslims. I'm just looking at the reality. The Jews are like, Oh shit! Some Syrians are coming. Build a wall! Build a wall!
And now they're voting for tearing down the European border fences.
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah, in which case they should just say, we have no countries, we have no laws, we
Yeah.
have no borders. They should all just, and actually that'd be great.
It's all yours.
The government shut down, let's get our free society finally. I think that'd be worth it. I'll take all the Muslims in the world if we can have a free society because of it.
Yeah,
Because
well,
that's a separation of church and state. There's no state. Yay.
the
But that's
question
not going to
is,
happen.
the question is if we would be there to witness it.
Well, no, it's not going to happen anyway. But because, all prior government programs are the excuse for new and more powerful and disgusting and vile and horrible government programs. So the previous government program called, we're going to bring stability, democracy, and peace to the Middle East. Well, that government program is now giving rise to a new government program called, we have to tax the living hell out of you, kick you out of your house, because there's refugees from our peace mission. And it's
And,
like, okay, so all government programs just lead to more and more government programs until there's a collapse.
and you
Now,
get
when
the
there's a
love.
collapse, I think a lot of people from Syria are going to go, what, it snows? Is gold? I don't like the gold. So, without the, shitting gold on them through the form of German tax extracted blood treasure welfare state, I mean, I don't know.
And free
Might go
women.
patch things up. Sorry?
And free women, of course. I mean,
Yeah, I was reading somewhere. It's just probably nonsense, but I was reading because I don't want to judge from the photos, but it does seem like there are quite a lot of healthy young men among these migrants.
just some.
Not a huge amount, but more than you would expect by statistical averages. And some people are saying, oh, well, you see, the Saudis just kept the women and got rid of the young men. Because, boy, have you ever heard of any problems in the world from a large number of unemployed and unmarried young men? Boy, they tend to not be the most stable element on society. Basically, it's like swallowing a tube full of nitroglycerin and going to Sky Zone and jumping on trampolines on the wall. Kaboom! Right? Unemployed and unmarried young men are the bane of every society's existence. And hey, you've now got a couple of 100,000 people of that description and with an ideology that is not exactly compatible with your way of life. Good luck. So, I mean, look, one or two things is going to happen. I mean, Western European culture has been, crippled, of course, by the 20th century. Was just brutal on the West, right? You had two giant world wars that carried off tens of millions of the most case-selected and assertive and confident parts of the culture. And, we're left with kind of the dregs, kind of like a bunch of weak-kneed social justice warriors who need hug rooms when they encounter data counter to their own prejudices. So, either either the culture is going to just fade away, at least, maybe we'll all end up living in Iceland or New Zealand or something like that. I don't know. But either the culture is just going to fade away, which, it's evolution. I mean, this is, you either stand up for, for who you are or you don't. And if you don't stand up for who you are, then you get overrun. Right? Sadly, the world doesn't run on philosophy. The world runs on the will to power, as
That's the
general. And Nietzsche
question.
would talk about it, right? And so, yeah, you can just let people walk all over you, in which case they take all of your stuff and your culture goes into the ash bin of history. I don't think that's going to happen. And I've made this speech before, but, white people as a whole, and I don't want to speak for white people as a whole, just from, studying a lot of Western history. But white people are very, very accommodating and very, very appeasing until they're not. And then when they're not, people remember why whites had the biggest empire in history.
Yes.
Because white people will bend over backwards to accommodate you, but when they finally get that they're just being taken advantage of, well, then you will see a backlash.
Yeah.
And that backlash will be quick, decisive, and brutal. So, again, to talk about the history of our respective countries, taking the mainstream narrative, there was a lot of appeasement of Hitler. A lot of appeasement of Hitler under Chamberlain and so on. And then there wasn't, right? And then there was a whole lot of not, right? And my mother, of course, who's German and suffered through intense bombings. And there was, the British people were like, okay, no war, no war. Okay, we're gonna have war. Fuck you, right? I mean, and then there's just no, and this is what we want to avoid.
Yeah, but that's a danger that I see because as soon as you fight for your freedom or for your rights in this case, the oh, there are here they are again, the Nazis would be the first thing you would hear.
Right. And at some point, and I'm not saying I welcome this, but this is why we need to be able to talk about it. We want to avoid that kind of
Of
stuff, right?
course,
Because the question is this going to provoke a Hitler 2.0? Right? We don't know. And again, I don't mean to put Germany in the spotlight. It could happen anywhere. It could happen anywhere. But at some point, people are going to go, I have just woken up. I do not recognize this country. I'm going to fight back. And the white backlash trigger switch is turned on. And then whites change to become like completely unrecognizable. Hey, where was this nice person, right? Before, where was this nice person who just wanted to help out? It's like, well, they're nice. White people are nice until they're not. And then they're really, really not nice.
indeed.
And people forget that. There are until they can't be R anymore. And then, boom, it's like, it's weird what happens in history. There's just this crazy switch. And the British people were terrified of war because everybody in the 1930s thought that with the advent of the bomber, everybody would just be wiped out the moment war was declared. And British people were terrified of war throughout the 1930s. And then when war was inevitable, they saw it through to the end, standing on top of tens of millions of bodies. And the Germans too, right? The Germans accepted some of the Versailles Treaty and were willing to have an army of less than 100,000 and no air force and so on until they weren't. And I think we've all been in this situation. I've certainly been in this situation in my life where I'm like, I'm going to appease, I'm going to be nice, I'm going to keep the peace, and then suddenly I'm just like, and I felt the switch within myself. I felt this. This is just it's a personal matter. I don't want to bore you all with relationship stuff, but I felt this issue in myself. I was in relationships where I was like, I was kind of being bullied. I was kind of like, okay, well, I'll keep the peace, or maybe they have a point, or maybe I could improve these things about myself. And then, like one night, boom, the switch flipped. I got out. I never looked back.
Your
And
personal
that
German came
switch.
out.
I'm sorry. Yeah, my inner German came on. That's right. Freedom is my Poland. So this switch that happens in maybe it happens for everyone. I'm just talking about mostly I've studied European history, but the switch people, is this true? Same is true of British people as well. Very accommodating, very polite, bend over backwards. But boy, the moment they realize that you have bad intentions and you're just there to take advantage of them, all of that stored up goodwill turns immediately to a cold anger. And boy, you saw that comment, Mike, and you remembered it better than I did. Don't turn us into those monsters again.
Seen a few of those comments in the YouTube video.
And what did they do? Remember what they said? You don't have to find the exact one, just the gist.
Oh, that was pretty much it. The concern
They're
about Hitler
basically
2.0, concerned
they were
about
basically Sorry, go ahead.
concerned about uh, essentially just giving in, not being able to talk about stuff, pushing stuff down, and then a violent eruption when people
Indeed.
have enough. I mean, we talk a bit about the silent majority that's occurred in the United States with Donald Trump's electoral success as of late. And, if you get a silent majority of people that are very upset at certain minority groups and don't feel that they're being represented politically, and it just goes on and on and on. I mean, if you get a silent majority of that, that could be incredibly hostile and nasty down the road. Incredibly hostile
Indeed.
and nasty.
I mean, if I may say so, you have a group that forms every Monday in Dresden. And the last time they formed, there were around 20,000 people. And Angela Merkel herself spoke not very kindly of them. And they are always cursed and harassed by the media, and they're pushed into the right corner. They just want clearance and they just want help and they're just afraid and nobody cares about them. And so when you're not cared about and when nobody is interested in your needs and in your fears, you don't trust your government. You don't trust the people who you should trust. I mean, to a specific point. But on the other hand, if nobody listens, you will get to the corner that gets the violent part done. They push the people to these corners where they have to do specific things that are not nice because nobody listened.
Yeah, if you're a husband and you've got a wife who's got legitimate complaints about you and you just keep screaming at her and humiliating her
Yeah.
and threatening her every time she voices her concerns, I mean, she'll just kill you in your sleep.
Mm.
If she can't get away, you can't, right?
And if I mean, if somebody bullies you and you go to your teacher, stuff like that, and he just says, "Well, you're a crazy guy yourself. I don't trust you so much, and what you say
Or
is,
he's, you
I
know,
don't
you
like
provoked
it."
him. He's perfect. You're the bad guy.
Yeah. So, and what is the consequence of this? The next time you got bullied, you don't ask help for help. You act, and sometimes the thing you do will be not very nice, and then you're judged. So, this is a vicious circle you can't escape.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also struck me that, you know, this idea that, well, you know, other countries armed people in Syria, and therefore, you know, ISIS and civil war and 250,000 dead within their own country. I mean, in the 1940s, America lent huge amounts of weapons and money to England in the Lend-Lease program, and they didn't descend into this kind of barbarism. The fact that there's external funding of an army, anyway, it doesn't lead to this stuff. So, I mean, my goal, of course, as always, is to try and minimize the escalations of violence that can occur in the world. And my concern is that people in Europe, particularly the young men, because the young men are not getting married and a lot of them don't have jobs. So I'm just guaranteeing you that is going to be a volatile section of society.
Of course.
And so you have on the Muslim side, you have people, young men who are unmarried because paucity of women, and they don't have jobs because of a wide variety of circumstances, language and culture and welfare and job restrictions and all that. So you've got two groups of people in the same living space, two groups of young men who are underutilized, bored, and not going through the civilizing process of getting married and becoming fathers. And when you get married, your testosterone goes down, and when you become a father, your testosterone goes down considerably. And if you don't get married and have kids as a young man, then your testosterone just stays crazy high.
Of course.
And so this is locking lions and tigers in the same cage without enough food for both. I mean, anybody who says that's a good idea I don't even know what to say to them. I mean, they've got this weird view of human nature that we just suddenly are not going to become tribal despite, 250,000 years of evolution preceded by a couple of billion before that, which is tribalism and aggression. So we do need to have these conversations. What are the answers? I don't know exactly what the answers are. I know what my ideal answers would be, but they're not going to happen. Eliminate the welfare state and all that. It's not going to happen. So I don't know what the answers are, but I do know that we need to have these conversations. And I also know that just screaming Nazi and xenophobe at people who are bringing up legitimate concerns, there is enough data out there. And I just went through two tiny pieces about the no-go zones in France and the rapes of Swedish women. It's just two tiny pieces of data. And IQ is another piece of data, and culture and incompatible, if not downright oppositional cultures, and young unmarried. Like, these are just data points and historical facts sort of gleaned from historical studies. These are things to talk about. And the fact that nobody is really allowing anyone to talk about this is stuffing more ammunition into a powder keg that sure as shit is going to go off sooner or later, because it always does. You don't listen to the people, and you impose things on the people that they don't want and they don't like. And at some point, the people, and in particular the young men, look at the government and say, you are my enemy. You are not only not looking out for my interests, you are actively working against my interests. I no longer expect you to enforce the law. And then what happens is people start taking the law into their own hands. You get Kristallnacht, you get this kind of stuff, and things get very bad. And this is not where we want society to go. So we need to put a moratorium on this. We need to have a frank and open conversation about it. There at least needs to be a referendum. I mean, this is supposed to be a goddamn democracy in Europe. How about a referendum
We don't get
on
it.
this issue? You won't get it. But so,
No.
and if you don't get it, then things are just going to escalate, in my opinion. Now, maybe there's something I'm certainly far from omniscient. I mean, it could be some things that I've missed. I could be completely wrong. Maybe they are all a bunch of engineers and doctors, and things are going to go peachy keen or whatever, right? The data doesn't support it. And there are so many pieces of evidence that go against that thesis that I consider it practically impossible. But if all of the evidence of history, all the evidence of genetics, all the evidence of the Middle Eastern history and their conflicts therein, if all of the evidence of incompatible, I mean, just look at the Northern Ireland and look at the Protestants and Catholics. They're the same Judeo-Christian religion. They have not been getting along for 500 years. I mean, for God's sakes, can we learn from history for one time and recognize that just continuing to impose opposing groups in the same geographical area is like introducing two subspecies of the same species in the same geographical area, hunting the same food. One of them will generally try to wipe out the other sooner or later. We've got to learn from these things. And if we don't learn this time, given all the weaponry that is around and given all of the crazy stuff that you can cook up in your basement these days, I mean, how many people are going to have to die before we recognize that we really should have had those conversations earlier, and we really should have listened to reason and evidence. We really should have listened to history, and we should have allowed the people to have a voice.
Yeah. The next thing is that you have, in the wake of the migrant crisis, the German government slipped, what do you call it? They are now allowed to use the German army inside the country.
Oh, Passa Comitatus has been violated?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm sure that's because they know.
They fear the big boom.
Yeah. No, they know. These are oppositional cultures.
Yeah.
These are oppositional. I mean, God, there was a lot of fear of Irish people in America. They're Catholics, they're drunks, they're angry, they fight, they write well, all of which is true. But I mean, fear enough of, that's Western tradition, white people, but they're Irish, you see. And there was a lot of fear and real challenges with that population, a little bit more compatible than Middle East and Germany. I mean, what's next? Forcibly airlifting people from Iceland to Somalia? They'll be fine. Let's put the Inuit on Mercury. They'll be fine. God. Anyway, I mean, it's blindingly obvious, but I think that there can be an upside, which is that my frustration for 30 plus years now has been people don't listen to reason. We've got a whole the death of reason presentation. People don't listen to reason. So you keep making your predictions. You keep going out on the limb and saying what you think is going to happen. And anybody who thinks that this is anti-Muslim or whatever is ridiculous. What my ultimate goal would be continue to preach reason into the ether as I do pretty much every day on this show, continue to preach reason and evidence, and slowly start to detach people from their superstitious ideologies and so on. Then we can have more of a gentle landing where people from the Middle East and other places which are still rife in nationalism and superstition and all that, yes, we can get them into the modern world and continue to preach reason to everyone. That's how we want to build, particularly better parenting. Yeah. You know, Syria is a hellhole because everybody's childhood is hell. Everybody's childhood is hell out there. And until you can improve childhood, there's no point. I mean, the idea that, oh, we're going to go and kill Saddam Hussein and now the Iraqis are going to be free and secular and Western and modern. It's like, no, they still had the childhoods they had that programmed them to be a certain way. And again, there's still free will in there. But we've got to preach peaceful parenting. We have to get a better at bringing reason and evidence to these societies to replace religion with philosophy in the long run, without it going crazy lefty and secular materialism and economic determinism and all that kind of crap. that is the plan that we have. So it's not like anti-Muslim. It's just recognizing that right now it's not ready. It's like what I said in the South African presentation. The blacks' middle class was not big enough to provide economic and political stability. It was too soon. It was too soon. And, you put a kid on a bike too soon, they'll lose a tooth. It's just the way it works, right? I mean, so people want to go listen to The Origins of War and Child Abuse. It's a full audio book that you can find at freedomainradio.com, or you can find it on this YouTube channel. Just need to listen to that to understand the degree to which society is run by early childhood experiences. If you want to improve society, you have to improve early childhood experiences. And we're going to get a whole lot of worse childhoods coming out of this mess.